Choosing a lens is as much a technical decision as it is a creative one. Ultimately, your goal is to use the lens as a tool to achieve your creative vision. One of the key factors when selecting a lens is the lens speed. And what we mean by speed is the lens maximum aperture. How big is the opening when it's fully open? One of the advantages of fast lenses is not only the low light situation, but also the ability to then have some very shallow depth of field, which can be very appealing when you're filming certain shots. The next key factor to look at when selecting a lens is its focal length. The background has a tendency of compressing towards your foreground. As we go longer and longer in focal length, you can see how it affects the look of the image. Now, there's no single best lens. It's about what works for your project and your style. It's about how the lens performs in your environment and whether it gives you the results that you're going for.